Welcome everyone to the first of four summer energy talks of Energy at UT hosted by the Energy Institute. The other three talks will be at the same time, the following three Tuesdays. Today, I'm Kerry Keene, Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute. I'm hosting Richard Heinberg, who is a Senior Fellow at the Post Carbon Institute. We are going to have a conversation about the takeaways from the movie Planet of the Humans, and this conversation will be on the role of energy in society. So welcome, Richard.
Good to be with you, Kerry.
Thank you. So just a little background on Richard. Richard is Senior Fellow with the Post Carbon Institute. He's authored over a dozen books now on energy and the environment, including Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels, and Renewable Future. He's won awards for his publications, and he's been published in Nature and the Wall Street Journal. He's been cited as an inspiration for the International Transition Towns movement, which seeks to build community resilience and ahead of climate change. He lives in a permaculture home in Santa Rosa, California. So here we are to talk about the movie Planet of the Humans. It was just directed by Jeff Gibbs and produced by Michael Moore. Of course, the Planet of the Humans is a take on the 1968 movie Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston. And of course, we humans are apes, so the play on words is entertaining and fun from that standpoint. If you look on Google and you YouTube Planet of the Humans, you will get Richard somehow listed as a cast member, although I think he was unaware he was listed as a cast member for this. Another interesting feature of looking at this just on a Google search is this audience rating summary. And what I find interesting here, 5 being I liked it and 1 being I didn't like the movie, is most of the audience ratings are either I liked it very much or hated it very much. And this seems to be part of the discussion and that we're going to have today. So there are a lot of people claiming that Planet of the Humans movie got it wrong. There are mistakes in the movie, there are old data. It's hurting the climate movement, hurting the environmental movement, hurting renewable energy. So this is a basis of some criticism. This criticism led to the movie being banned from YouTube for a while, but it was put back up in a freedom of speech type of campaign. And it was put up, wanted to be taken down in some sense irony. People view Michael Moore as being a fan of the left politically or ideologically, yet that is the side that was essentially calling for the removal of the movie from YouTube. But there are many organizations thinking that, and persons thinking that Planet of the Humans got something right. It's a game changer, sparked meaningful debate over an urgent issue, and that's what we're going to have today. Some people say the criticisms must have been watching a different movie. And Herman Daly, who has been a proponent of a steady state society and ecological economics, says the movie is giving us a good combination of thinking about, or presents the idea to talk about the role of technological fixes and what the limits to possible economic growth or physical growth. I find these topics quite compelling, of course, and I've worked the last few years writing a book, which is essentially on this topic, and the subtitle of the book, Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy Policy and Growth, lends to our discussion today. So this book will be available October 20th at all your favorite internet stores. So now we'll let Richard talk. If I've given this introduction, we're going to be asking these types of questions through our discussion. We will discuss for 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So please ask your questions in the Q&A feature of the Zoom chat, and we'll address them later as we go. So what are we to make of the movie Planet of the Humans? What are we to make of thinking about a renewable or low carbon energy transition? What are we to think about energy and economic linkages in general, and the media and discussion of energy and the economy in the public? How can we have this discussion? How can we have an informed public? So, Richard, take it away. First, what do you think the main points were from the movie, the takeaways? What should we take away? What should we not take away? What was good? What was bad? Over to you.
Okay, well, I am in the movie, just very briefly. I think I haven't timed it, but I would guess it's less than a minute of the movie, maybe even less than 30 seconds. And my portion of the movie was recorded as an interview in my backyard over 10 years ago, and I didn't have any subsequent contact with the filmmakers after that. So I wish I had, because I would have liked to have had more input into some of the statements and claims made in the movie. I was disappointed in some aspects of it. Michael Moore is a very confrontational character. You know, he likes to make bold statements and show people up as being silly or wrong in you know, in blatant ways. And I have a different style of communication, so some of it rubbed me the wrong way. Like he treated Bill McKibben, I think, pretty shabbily. Bill McKibben has been a pretty courageous campaigner for action on climate change, and he doesn't take a salary for his work with his organization 350.org, and you know, he's a good guy as far as I can tell. I know him slightly, and he was treated as if he was kind of a shill for the billionaire renewable energy investors. So basically, the film makes 2 points. One of which is that renewable energy is itself a sham. It's never going to amount to anything. And the second is that the mainstream environmental organizations have sold their souls for a techno fix. They're selling the idea that all we have to do is get the political will for a transition to renewable energy, and all of our environmental problems will be solved. And the filmmakers contend that that's a deliberate falsehood. I think there's pretty good evidence for the first claim, at least to a certain extent. I wouldn't go as far as the filmmakers did in that regard. The second claim, I think, is a little bit more controversial, squishy. I would push back on that a little bit. And at the end of the day, I would say that overall, the film brings up some points that even if they're poorly made, even if they're made in ways that I wouldn't have done myself, they needed to be discussed. I think the filmmakers are correct in saying that the mainstream environmental movement has bought into the idea of technofixes for our fundamental underlying ecological crisis, and that they're failing to do their job at telling the people what actually needs to be done, what we actually face, and what really needs to be done. So maybe the movie wasn't done as skillfully as it could have been, but in the end, I think it was you know, some cold water in the face needed to happen.
Right. So from the standpoint of what you're calling techno fixes here, if you elaborate on that, it's techno fix where the species biodiversity is going away, and if we have the right technologies for energy, then we can save the species. Climate change, obviously, if we have enough of the right technology, we can lower carbon emissions and save the environment or water supplies and land use. Land, of course, is a controversial area in terms of the land taken up by renewables versus any energy technology. So you want to expand on that?
Sure. Essentially, the environmental movement over the last 10, 20 years has come to focus laser-like on climate change over any other environmental problem. We still have burgeoning environmental pollution, plastic in the oceans. We have the crisis of loss of biodiversity. We have the problem of modern industrial agriculture and destroying topsoil, reducing biodiversity, on and on and on. And many of these problems seem to be, very clearly tied to growing human population and growing levels of human consumption. We extract raw materials, we process them into products, manufactured products, and those end up becoming industrial waste at the end of the cycle. And that fundamental economic process is inherently unsustainable on a finite planet. But rather than focusing on that, all of the attention has gone to climate change. And in some ways, that's entirely understandable. Climate change is the most serious environmental problem humanity's ever faced. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to be horrendous, no question. But then, having focused just on that one problem, then the solution that's being proposed is to transition to solar and wind renewable energy. And the proposal is we'll be able to do that. All we have to do is summon the investment capital. We'll be able to do that and then continue living essentially as we are now. We'll still have economic growth. We'll have more jobs. Everyone will be happier. And 20 years from now, we'll look back and there was hardly even a speed bump in the road. That, I think, is extremely, it's a disservice, I think, to the constituency of the environmental movement to frame things that way, because the evidence suggests that that's not in the cards. That's not what's going to happen. And even in the best case, it probably is impossible. Even if we get the political will and the investment capital, the technical hurdles to making something like that happen are just prohibitive. So realistically, we face a future of choice. We have to give things up in order to deal with the biodiversity crisis. We're going to have to reduce human population and consumption. Same thing with climate change, same thing with resource depletion, pollution in the oceans, and so on. There's no technological fix that will enable us to continue living the kinds of high energy, high consumptive lifestyles that we're accustomed to, and at the same time solve all these problems. So that's the essence of the techno fix.
Right, so you got a lot to unpack there: population, techno fix, lifestyles. So let's maybe break this down a little bit.
Sure.
If we think about in some sense, a straw man argument that we can sort of break down, the fossil fuels, a proponent argument might be, look at all the stuff we have. It's in some sense self-evident that the size of the economy, the affluence of at least the developed countries have is essentially powered by fossil fuels. So the argument would be, well, don't you like that? Well, then we better stick with the horse that brought us here to keep going fossil fuels, right? So that's that argument. If, as you're saying, that renewable, if you're saying, well, yeah, we need to go, in that argument, the fossil argument might leave out climate change. They may take it on, they may not. The renewables argument, from a straw man optimistic standpoint, would say, well, yes, fossil fuels brought us here, but we've developed a lot more technology now. We're smarter now. We've got new technologies. Hey, we got this. We can leave the fossil fuels and we got it going forward. You're saying not so easy in terms of the renewable transition or low carbon transition. And you talk a lot about energy literacy, and you've written several books. So what can you say about the difficulties of communicating, whatever you can define energy literacy, what you might call that, and explaining why you would think renewables are challenging to take on all the roles of fossil fuels and maintain the same, let's just say, developed world lifestyle?
Right. Well, first of all, fossil fuels are amazing. There's no question about it. That's part of the problem that we face. Fossil fuels are energy dense, they're portable, they're storable, they're sources of energy unlike anything that human beings ever had previously. And that's why we have the modern industrial world with, 1 or 2% of the population growing all the food for everybody else, and everybody else living middle class lifestyles and having, thousands and thousands of jobs doing everything from newspaper reporter to uh, grocery store clerk and banker, and 20,000 unique job descriptions. Just the growth of society has been incredible during these last 150 years of fossil fueled industrialism. But the problem is not just climate change, it's also that fossil fuels are depleting non-renewable resources. And we extract them using the low-hanging fruit principle. In other words, we go after the highest quality, easiest to access fuels first, and leave the nasty, dirty, hard to get stuff for later. And gradually it's getting later.
Yeah.
So it takes more effort these days to find and produce a unit of petroleum or natural gas or coal than was the case even 2 or 3 decades ago. And that trend is accelerating. So we have to have a plan B. We can't just assume that people 200 or 300 years from now are still going to be able to use fossil fuels, because for the most part, they will no longer be around. We will have either used them or transitioned to not using them in favor of something else. So then the question is, well, what is that something else? And the options are pretty limited. There are those who say, well, we just transition to nuclear power. There are problems there. It's expensive. There are accidents. Requires massive government subsidies, or at least the technology has up to this point. The nuclear proponents say that there are new kinds of nuclear technology that will be safer, that will be cheaper, and so on, but these haven't been proven at scale. On the other hand, we have solar and wind, which have been developed, are getting cheaper, and there's a wide constituency of folks who are in favor of developing solar and wind, unlike nuclear, which is much less popular with the general public. So, well, how about solar and wind? There are problems with solar and wind power, and people in the energy world are very familiar with these. One of them is the 20% problem. Solar and wind, and nuclear for that matter, produce electricity. Electricity is a very high quality energy carrier. We can do a lot with electricity, but currently, of the final energy that we use, only 20% is used in the form of electricity. The other 80% of the energy that we use is in the forms of liquid, gaseous, solid fuels. The gasoline you use to drive your car, that can be electrified by driving an electric car. But if you apply that strategy across the board, that means we need an enormous amount of new energy using infrastructure. It's not just a matter of building a lot of solar panels and wind turbines, but also of changing out roughly 80% of the technology that we're using so that it's electric rather than burning something else. Or there's another strategy for dealing with the 20% problem, and that is to produce just an enormous amount of electricity and use some of that to produce some kinds of synthetic fuels, ammonia or methanol, or the chemical possibilities are various. They're not limitless, but there are several. And then that would also provide some energy storage. The difficulty there is doing that at scale, because if we tried to transition using solar and wind electricity to producing synthetic fuels sufficient in quantity, to run aviation, most of the rest of transportation, high heat industrial processes, and all these other things we do with fossil fuels. That would require a huge infrastructure, an infrastructure roughly the same size as our current fossil fuel infrastructure. But we wouldn't be able to use the same infrastructure. It would mean, changing it out. So again, that's an enormous investment required. Then there's the intermittency problem. Solar and wind are intermittent. Sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. So there are three possible strategies for that. One is energy storage. Batteries are one option, but they're only good mostly for diurnal intermittency, over day and night. But seasonal intermittency, what if you have 2 weeks without wind or and cloudy days? Well, for that kind of long-term intermittency, you really need something like what we were just talking about, storage of fuels that you've produced. So again, we have the problem of the infrastructure required for that. So then the other way of dealing with intermittency is demand management, just changing how we use energy so that we're only using it when it's actually available. And that requires change in people's expectations and habits. Right now, our expectation is that energy is always available for us in any quantity that we want to use. Just flip the switch, or press the button or turn the key in your car or whatever. And it's there for us. Adapting to using energy only when it's available will have economic as well as psychological implications. So these are just some of the challenges in a transition to a renewable energy economy. Energy determines the nature of societies. When we talk about moving from a hunter-gatherer culture to an agrarian society, we're really talking about a shift in energy source. And when the energy source of a society changes, almost everything about the society changes and adapts. That's what happened when we went from being an agrarian society to a fossil-fueled industrial society. Everything changed. Our economic system, work patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to assume that shifting from a fossil-fueled industrial society to a renewable energy industrial society is going to be a similar scale of transformation. We don't know exactly what that's going to be, but it's going to require some pretty heavy adaptation. And in our view at Post Carbon Institute, we've been analyzing this for several years, having extensive discussions with experts. Our view is that one of those adaptations, one of the key adaptations, will be having to use less energy for just about everything. And that conflicts with our current economic paradigm, which is the paradigm of continual, perpetual growth. We assume that the economy can grow in perpetuity. And the only way that can happen is if we have more and more energy available to fuel industrial processes. But if we have less energy, that's going to mean a static or even contracting economy. And we're not ready for that. Our financial system is not geared for that. And our expectations, our political system is not geared for it either.
Right, so a lot to unpack there again. So brought up, what's the link between the energy supply and the societal structure, which I agree with. I think these are great ways to think about it. Growth, the most common metric, of course, gross domestic product for the economy as a whole, and then this leads people to try to think about other metrics of growth. But from my own research, GDP does seem to be a good proxy measure for physical growth, and physical growth seems to require more energy consumption. If you have another car, another building, it has a fuel that is input into it to make it operate. Otherwise, it doesn't operate. As Steve Keen says, a machine without energy is a sculpture, right? So if you don't have the energy input, it doesn't move. And GDP effectively measures how much things are moving, how much things are getting transformed. So in this adaptation of use less, how do you or the Post-Carbon Institute see the metrics for growth? How do should we look at other metrics? Many people look at it and say, okay, we can be a prosperous human life with less consumption. And so I didn't need to focus on these physical metrics of consumption. How do y'all see that?
Right. Well, GDP is a flawed metric. It measures one thing, and that's fine. It's an interesting thing to measure how much money is flowing through the economy over on an annual basis. But should we make that the key indicator for how well society is doing, for how well the economy is doing? And there are many critics of GDP in that regard, including, I think you mentioned Herman Daly, who has been writing about this for decades now. It's a perverse indicator because there are many ways in which society could be becoming more unequal, in which life could be becoming more difficult and onerous for the general population. And yet the GDP is still going up. So an economist looking at that society would say, what's the problem? If we start paying more attention to the factors that actually influence people's well-being, the quality of the relationships, how well society is doing in terms of health, education, how many people are in prison, how much money are we spending on weaponry as opposed to things that actually make people's lives better. If we start looking at society through that lens, then we could actually make people's lives more happy and enjoyable, even as the economy contracts. And we're getting a taste of that right now with the coronavirus pandemic. The economy has contracted, and of course, the federal government and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, are doing all they can to keep the economy from actually collapsing, which of course is the right thing to do. But the assumption is that we're going to get it back to traditional GDP growth. That may or may not happen. But in the meantime, are there things that we can do to improve people's health and well-being? And a lot of people are talking about that. Why aren't we funding more of the things that will enable that to happen rather than just worrying about GDP? That's a discussion that I think needs to really take off and continue, because we're in a new era here. And as I said, we may not get back to the pre-COVID normal. So how do we make sure people's needs are taken care of absent the growth machine?
Right, so this is obviously a huge question. You've linked the energy supply or the nature of an energy supply to societal structure. I'm guessing in the presidential debates coming up, there'll be perhaps President Trump discussing whether Joe Biden has taken on Bernie Sanders' platform and whether he's socialist or communist, and we'd like to see ourselves as capitalism. I think the more you think about it, the dividing line between a pure state-run society and a pure private-run society is there's no real dividing line for practically any country. And the COVID response here plays that out, and during disasters and other times of crisis, we play that out in terms of the government and the private industry working together and trying to provide for citizens. So in your writings and in the terms of, I guess, energy literacy, how have you thought about relating, let's just say, maybe words that people have heard, like capitalism, socialism, communism, and energy supply? Are these linked? How do we think about whether one is more capable or another of, say, going to a low carbon transition? Have
Right.
you thought about that? Some people might say, well, we've got to throw out capitalism if we're going to go low carbon, because capitalism is about private incentive, and private incentive is growth and consume more, and that's just not compatible. How do we wrap our heads around that?
Right. Well, if capitalism is tied at the hip to the need for growth, then that doesn't speak well for the future of capitalism. On the other hand, the assumption that large-scale state societies can continue to run everything from central planning is also problematic, because that scale of social organization requires high energy flow. We didn't have nations on the scale of nations today prior to fossil fuels. And there was a reason for that. The speed of communication and transportation was much slower. The scale of social organization, therefore, was much smaller. There were many people never traveled more than 100 miles from where they were born throughout their whole life. Today, we can, be halfway around the planet in just a few hours, and so that promotes a scale of social organization that's much larger. As we use less energy, as our energy usage is constrained by some of the factors we were talking about earlier, I think the right response would be to find ways of devolving the scale of social organization. And a simple term for that is localization, going back to more local organization of economic and political processes.
Do you see that localization as a proactive strategy, or as something that will just kind of come along? Let's just say, if we were to address climate change or go low carbon, there would be certain propagative actions that would lead to more localization.
Yeah, I think it's both. It's going to happen one way or another, I think. And we're already seeing that actually in response to the coronavirus crisis. I live in California, and our governor, Gavin Newsom, is talking about California as a nation state, because all of the states are largely looking after themselves in this situation.
That's our job in Texas, to talk about being a nation state, so you can't take that.
Yeah, right. So a lot of people are already thinking along these lines, and there are more and more incentives for doing so. And I think the proactive part of that is worth exploring. Can we make this transition to a more localized kind of society? Can we optimize that transition by doing it more proactively, thinking more about shortening supply chains, creating more local political autonomy in various ways? These are all questions that are difficult. It's not a simple cost-benefit analysis, because for every benefit there is a cost. And there are many good reasons for saying, well, we shouldn't even think about localism because there are just too many social and political costs involved. But then on the other hand, you have the more or less inevitability of this happening as a result of less mobility, less energy, and the social impacts that are almost certainly going to come about as a result of that. And localism starts to look pretty good. And that's one of the reasons you mentioned when you introduced me early on. My organization, Post Carbon Institute, has supported the Transition Towns initiative. And this, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a program that started about 15 years ago in Britain. And the idea is for people in local communities to get together and find ways to celebrate their local community and transition it to a post-fossil fuel future in ways that can be understood and managed by the participants, rather than just leaving it to national and international agreements and laws. So there are limits to how much can be accomplished along those lines, but it's worth exploring.
Right. So you can imagine sort of a devil's advocate argument. They would say, "Oh, Richard's saying, yeah, we probably have to change lifestyles to go low carbon and renewables to some degree." And I want to get back to the rate of change of infrastructure right before we go to questions.
Sure.
That's a topic near and dear to my heart. And you're saying, okay, localization may be already happening, and COVID is kind of showing this. The argument against that would be like, okay, yeah, so if there are social changes that come with going more local, and maybe we want to avoid these, some are good, some are bad, you point these out. Well, then let's keep trying, plan A. Let's keep doing what we're doing because we'll keep the global society going, right? So that, I mean, this is kind of the argument. Well, the techno fix, not just for renewables, I guess, but just the society in general. How would you make the case, or how could anyone make the case? Oh, COVID is showing the same types of effects that we would expect from transition to low carbon. How would you know that, prove that, or
that's
about that?
That's a tough question, because there are many. For every similarity, there's a dissimilarity. But I would just point out that COVID is stressing our economic system in a pretty profound way, and in somewhat the same ways that we could anticipate, maybe 20 years down the line as a result of, energy scarcity. So in some ways, it's kind of a practice run. How do we respond as a society in a way that emphasizes the pro-social behaviors, as opposed to anti-social behaviors that result in society becoming more atomized and less functional.
Right. So let's go back to this rate of energy infrastructure change to go low carbon, adding a lot more infrastructure. The rate of change this is an area that I dedicate a lot of my research time to, is trying to understand economic models that can actually have the true dynamics, if you will, of the rate of change of our energy infrastructure and what the feedbacks on the economy might be. I know you've thought about this some as well. And what COVID might be showing us is, I would claim that understanding at least the basic set of equations for disease propagation or epidemiology are similar. They're simpler than understanding the economy to one extent, but the similarity is that there's a delay in action today produces a delay. And in this COVID delay is 14 days, let's just say, till you might see some expression of symptoms if you are infected. Deaths or hospitalizations, maybe a month or weeks or a month down the road. So we're talking about delays of weeks, maybe a month or two. With low carbon transition, going low carbon, we're talking about seeing benefits 100 years, 50 years, 30 years from now, if you want to get close. If people are having a hard time understanding this with COVID, and we've experienced this real-time delay, it's now been months, we have experienced it, people have experience with that notion. Is that an opportunity to describe better what we anticipate with going low carbon? How could you leverage that? And how do we talk about the rate of change of energy infrastructure? I'm with you on that. If we change it relatively quickly, there'll be potentially near-term, let's just say even recession if you invest quickly enough, but there could be some benefits down the road. And most economic modeling essentially sort of doesn't even recognize that real dynamic, which is my research goal, is to try to explain that. So go ahead. So
Right. Yeah. The rate of investment and the rate of technological change is a really significant factor, as you say, both from an economic standpoint, also from the climate standpoint, and an energy standpoint. So from a climate standpoint, we really need to move fast if we're going to avoid some of the tipping points that the science suggests are out there, having to do with methane release and so on. If we want to avoid some of those tipping points that would set us onto a path of, several degrees Celsius warming, which might make Earth uninhabitable, at least in terms of civilization. Possibly a few scattered human survivors would still be out there, but it's the hothouse Earth doomsday scenario we're talking about. If we want to avoid that, we're going to actually have to invest pretty fast. But what are the implications of investing and adapting rapidly? Well, of course, there's the just how much money would have to be devoted to the project, and we're talking about many trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars on a global basis. And then what would be the energy and climate implications of doing that with the expectation of making a full transition, so that at the end of the day, we're producing and using as much energy from renewable sources as we are currently from fossil fuels. If we tried to do that, and do it rapidly, we would actually be defeating our own purpose. And this is why. All of the infrastructure we were talking about earlier, not only building solar panels and wind turbines, but building replacements for much of our transportation infrastructure, building a huge new infrastructure for creating and storing synthetic fuels using sunlight and wind electricity to create synthetic fuels to power aviation, industrial processes, and so on. All of that takes money, but it also takes energy. So building that much infrastructure in a short period of time, say over the period of 10, 20 years, or even 30 years, would require a much higher level of industrial throughput than is ordinarily the case. So that would mean most of the energy for that would have to come from fossil fuels, because currently fossil fuels are providing 80%, 85% of our energy, and that would only change incrementally. So at least in the early phases, most of the energy for that transition phase would be coming from fossil fuels. So that means if we try to do a short, full energy transition to a, renewable energy society that's using our current amount of energy or more, we would be producing a burst of carbon emissions significantly higher than our current average annual rate. So we would, in that way, we would actually be defeating our purpose. The only way out of that trap is to plan for energy reduction, both to make it cheaper and easier to produce that much infrastructure, and also to avoid producing that burst of emissions in producing all of that new infrastructure. So that's...
All right, I was going to follow up. I think you roughly answered my question there. So I'll make one comment and then go over to the Q&A to Varun to ask a question from the Q&A panel. So in your mind, if we had a quick burst of energy infrastructure to go low carbon, we could expect higher emissions in that. And as a result, as a plan, you would say, well, we should plan on reducing other forms of consumption so that we compensate and we don't have a huge burst of emissions. Go low carbon. I think if we go fast enough, you actually induce a recession. So I think that could happen naturally, and I'm working on stuff for that. Understand that.
I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah. So a question from Q&A.
Great. This question, Richard, is related to your remarks on localization, and the question is, how do you propose we move to a lower energy society? What needs to be changed or imposed on the society? What does it look like?
Right. Well, there's so many parts to that. How do we localize society? Well, part of it is import substitution, finding ways to make more of our stuff more close by, and finding ways to do without stuff that we can't make close by. Localizing food systems seems to be the part of the puzzle that attracts people's imagination and interest first, because people like local food, and it's already furthest along in terms of people's thinking. You know, how do we reduce those food miles? How do we create opportunities for local farmers, promoting farmers markets, and so on? That seems to be a good way of getting started with the localization process. But then finding ways to localize investment is a real challenge, because right now the system is set up to encourage just about all investment to go into pension funds, hedge funds, so on, that are just investing on a national or global basis. If you actually want to go out and invest your money, say you have a little retirement portfolio and you want to invest it locally, that's hard work, just figuring out how to do that. There are people working on solutions to that problem. A guy named Michael Schumann, who's one of our post-carbon fellows, has written a book on that subject and is continuing research on how to localize investment to support local economies. I mean, as things localize, the people in your community are going to be the people that you will be depending on. I mean, we learned this in here where I live in Northern California, Santa Rosa, a couple of years ago when we had wildfires. You know, it was your neighbors that you looked to for help. The federal government was the furthest thing from your mind. And that's how it is as things localize, as larger structures tend to become less functional as they start to break down. You realize that your life really depends upon your neighbors and your fellow community members. So how do you get to know them? How do you work with them? What political structures enable local problems to be solved? It's an iterative process. There's no one size fits all, but there are a lot of people who've been thinking about this for some time. There's a school of thought called bioregionalism that has been around since the 1970s, and some of the issues that I've been talking about have been hashed through endlessly by folks who are schooled in that field of thought. So,
we had one follow-up on that. So, in this sort of more regional, more local context, how much can be, I guess, industrial versus, I mean, you've got a permaculture house. A lot of the things you're saying, I think people might think, oh, I'm going to go back to a pastoral lifestyle. In some sense, it's iterative. I think I agree with what you're saying, is maybe we don't exactly know, but it is a question of how much you can be proactive versus just, if it's forced upon you for whatever reasons, we will figure something out and we'll become more local, and more local ownership as opposed to ownership by who knows who living in some other place, owning the. So is it partly owning things locally?
Well, yeah. I mean, having your productive enterprise land and so on owned by people far away is not very conducive to a functional local economy or political system. I would just point out there's one area of globalization, if you will, that I think we should try to preserve as much as possible, and that's in the area of electronic communications. And here, you know, solar and wind are really good at producing electricity. That's what they do. And our communications are digital these days. It's all been digitized. Our scientific knowledge, our medical knowledge, our understanding of the universe around us, all of that is now electronic. And if the grid goes down, we lose it all. That would be the worst case scenario for sort of collapse of civilization. So I think that should be really our first priority as we transition our energy infrastructure. Our first priority should be to shore up the grid as a conduit for large-scale, long-range communications and for preserving knowledge and data. And then everything else the rest is kind of icing on the cake. I mean, we're figuring out right now how life goes on with only a shadow of an aviation industry, you know, compared to what we were used to a year or two ago. Global aviation right now is just a vestige, and life is going on. You know, there are things we can do without. We can have Zoom meetings instead of flying to another city for a business meeting. But again, if the grid goes down, we lose everything. So we need to prioritize.
Right, thanks for that. So another question from the Q&A?
Yeah, this question, Richard, is on energy efficiency. So could you please address the impact of energy efficiency, for example, building design, balancing growth and energy use, and what should be the role of government in such efforts?
Right. Well, the more efficient our energy usage, the less we have to give up in terms of real services as our energy usage declines. And there's a lot that can be accomplished with energy efficiency. At the same time, energy efficiency is subject to the law of diminishing returns. You can't make a process more and more and more and more efficient, and then at the end of the day, continue making it even more efficient. Beyond a certain point, every increment of new efficiency has a cost, and that cost beyond a certain point is actually greater than the benefit that you get from the new efficiency measures. So we're already close to that in some fields. I mean, I doubt if we're going to make light bulbs that are, you know, an order of magnitude more efficient than LEDs, for example. We've probably pretty much reached the end point of inefficiency there. And there are other fields too, but there are lots of fields where that's not the case, and we need to do what we can in that regard. And if government regulations could help, fine. The energy transition it will have some energy efficiency benefits in that we currently burn coal and natural gas to produce electricity. And that's a very inefficient process. We waste a lot of energy in doing that. However, the energy transition will introduce some new inefficiencies in the form of energy storage. Batteries are inefficient inherently. I mean, we can reduce those inefficiencies, but you're losing energy in the process of storing energy. And if we go the route of producing synthetic fuels on a large scale, there are very large inefficiencies involved in the energy transformations involved there, and also in energy storage and transportation and so on. So on the whole, it's probably a wash. You know, we can make some individual technologies more efficient along the way, but the system as a whole, at the end of the day, after the transition, may or may not be that much more efficient.
Do we have to pay attention to whether efficiency enhances growth and have more carbon emissions? We only have a few minutes left. That's a broad topic, but how would you think about that? And we can have one more question.
Yeah, well, I mean, if efficiency is resulting in actual decoupling of energy usage from benefits, then it's certainly a good thing. The overall picture that we're seeing of economic decoupling as we track societies over time is that not much has actually been achieved. In other words, in terms of the benefits of economic activity to the world as a whole over the last few decades, the amount of energy and materials that we've had to feed into the economic process, that's been pretty much a one-to-one relationship. So there hasn't been much decoupling, and it may not be possible to achieve very much decoupling.
Right, I think it's a great topic to touch on in the book. So we'll go, my book coming out October. One more, we have time for one more question here on the Q&A, I think.
Yeah, this question is around the GDP and its measures. Do you have suggestions for alternative measures, or at least, what should constitute those alternative measures?
Yeah, there's a literature on something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, and you can just look that up, Google it. There's a Wikipedia page on it. And there's another indicator that's attracted attention in the last few years called gross national happiness. And this was pioneered by the nation of Bhutan in the Himalayas, starting in the 1970s. And the idea is, what we really want is for people to be happy. So if we measure happiness and aim toward happiness, maybe we'll do very different things and achieve something more as a result. And it's true, you look at happiness studies, and people there's a general correlation as societies become wealthier, people become a little happier, but beyond a certain point, that correlation breaks down. There are people in societies with an average GDP, per capita GDP, 1/5 that of the United States, that have levels of happiness that actually exceed the levels of typical Americans. So gross national happiness has something to be said for it. And again, you can find out more about it just by using your search engine.
Do you know of, I guess besides Bhutan, is anybody using GPI or gross national happiness as actual decision-making criteria?
Yeah, increasingly. Costa Rica is doing a lot of happiness studies work. The state of Maryland and I believe the state of Washington have adopted GPI, or Genuine Progress Indicator, as alternative indicators for measuring and targeting state activities. So these ideas are getting out there.
Right.
Carrie, there are so many more questions, but we'll do with Q&A here.
Yeah, so we're at time here. So I'd like to thank Richard for joining us here for our first summer energy talk, and encourage everyone else to tune in for the following the next 3 weeks. So Richard, thank you very much again for an enlightening conversation. I enjoyed it. And thank you everyone for attending.
It's a pleasure talking with you, Carrie, and I look forward to reading your book.